Hello, this is part 5, continuing with the big lie, evolution or delusion, with amazing archaeological discoveries. And so we will first continue here. I will minimize myself, and we'll just go to this next one.
Right here, we can see Tim Mahoney in the foreground, and in the background, you can see the split rock, the first split rock.
Yes, okay.
So we went from the second one back to the first one here. And of course, Tim Mahoney, he is with the website patternsofevidence.com. They're putting together a documentary on this and the Red Sea crossing. But you can see in the distance the split rock on top of a 300-foot tall hill. The split rock is 50 feet in height. It's a very prominent rock. Now in Numbers 20:11, and Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice, and the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. So God provided for them. He gave them provision. And
water for 1 million people.
Yes.
And probably several million
so
animals.
Probably 3 million people, plus their livestock. So some people have been able to make it over there. The country is closed. You cannot get a tourist visa. So to get into the country is very difficult. And then getting out to the site, you have to have permits usually just to get to that area. But here you can see the split rock where you can see a large amount of water erosion. A large amount of water erosion coming down from the rock. In the foreground here, you can see channels being cut into the rock. The water has eroded the rock to a smooth surface here.
And this is the rock that in modern Western times that Jim and Penny Caldwell, I mean the Bedouin have always known this is here, but this is where Jim and Penny Caldwell discovered this one.
Yes. After Ron discovered the mountain, Jim and Penny went out there and they also found this rock. So very, very large rock. The split in the rock is so large you can actually walk through it. And a large amount of water erosion inside the rock itself. Here you can see how it stands out prominently above the peak there. And so here you can see the split in the rock where a person could walk through it. When God split it, it sure split, and then the water erosion coming up out of there, spewing up, it created more space probably in the rock, eroding it away. And you can see water erosion coming down from the rock.
Yeah, and even if you saw this and you were a skeptic and said, well, that rock has always been split, or it's a natural outcropping, and that erosion is wind erosion, well, you're not going to have wind erosion flowing down in a pattern similar to what water would create.
Yes, this is definitely water erosion coming down. Again, this is a desert area, very little rainfall at all out here, and yet all this water erosion you can see on the rocks coming down from this giant split rock. So God did provide water for them lovingly, even though they were impatient and rebellious, kind of like us, I guess.
Aren't we all? Yes.
Yeah. So in our next slide, you can see Ross Patterson. He's standing next to the split there in the rock.
Now, those who are not familiar with Ross Patterson, who is he in relation to all of this?
He's a friend of mine in New Zealand who also promotes Ron White's work.
Oh, very good.
Presentations, and he was able to make it out there. And so our next slide, we can see the altar Jehovah Nissi in the foreground. And in the background, we can see the split rock once again standing up. Very prominent rock in the background. And
so this is an altar of some kind.
This mentioned in the Bible, yes, this altar. So again, this is matching the biblical account once again. And there's also some circular rock formations. I don't know if they held the bottoms of the tents down or something, because you see some round rock formations where the children of Israel were encamped in this area.
That's similar to what we find in North America with the Cherokee Indians and such across the country, that in certain areas where they would camp, there's these circles where their tents were.
Okay, yeah.
At different times of the year, yeah.
Sure, yeah. So over on the other side of the mountain is the front of Mount Sinai, and you can see in the distance the blackened peak of the mountain. Once again, the Bible says that the mountain was a smoke. It was on fire, And so the mountaintop here is blackened. When you walk up to the top of the mountain, several people have, you turn the stone over, the top of it's black, the bottom of it is brown.
Really?
So there's evidence that it was burned on top, and the natural color is on the bottom, and it's brown.
Now that answers a question I was going to ask, and you've already answered it, because I have heard a secondary theory that this is just a different type of rock. It's a black rock that happens to have this line right at a certain point near the peak.
Yeah, but that's not the case. Yeah, this is a burned mountaintop because underneath it, it is brown material. So it's actually a day hike to make it to the top of the mountain and to make it back down. Strenuous walk. But people have been up there and they've seen the blackened, burned.
And that is the tallest mountain in the area.
It is. The upper 2/3 of Saudi Arabia is the tallest of mountains, and that's another clue that ancient historians have said that it was the tallest of mountains in Midian, and that's what it is.
Here it is from Josephus. We were just looking at that now. So Josephus said that Mount Sinai was the highest of mountains in the city of Midian, which is just outside of Al-Bad.
Yes, Al-Bad is 15 miles to the south.
Okay.
And Al-Bad is where Jethro is from. On some maps, you'll see the name Jethro next to Al-Bad. And the caves of Moses are there also at Al-Bad.
And also Philo said that Mount Sinai was located east of the Sinai Peninsula and south of Palestine, which puts it again in this vicinity.
Again, we're in the correct location. So you have all these ancient historians identifying the site, and you have the Bible saying Mount Sinai in Arabia, Galatians 4. So it's pretty incredible. It's been lost for so many millennia, and yet here it is coming out near the end of time for a demonstration of truth for mankind. So Exodus 19, and Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. My friend Aaron Sin was out there around 2003 with Tim Mahoney, and again you can see the blackened peak in the background, and at the base of the mountain, we'll see a little bit later, is the remains of an altar. Once again, fitting the biblical account. You can see a guardhouse on the right edge of this photo. They put a fence around the front of the mountain and a guardhouse and a sign telling people to stay away. This is an archaeological area. So the Saudi authorities are recognizing this as an archaeological site.
Well, having put that much effort into it, they know.
Yes.
They know darn well what this is.
Sure. And then another photo here from a distance further back from the mountain. You can see, again, the encampment area, and the left side of the photo in the distance, that's an area where Elijah's cave is. And here in the very center of the photo is Elijah's cave. It's in a shadow. It's in kind of the very center of the photo here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you can see it there.
Yeah. And Elijah, arose, he did eat and drink, and went in the strength of that meat 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb, the mount of God, and he came thither unto a cave and lodged there. 1 Kings 19.
Now, how many people would catch on to that this is the same? Because we hear of Elijah's cave, but normally you wouldn't tie the two together. You wouldn't stop at Mount Horeb. Oh, yes, that's right. This is the same place. It's funny that it's just all in the same area.
Everything matches here, the biblical account. And this is taken from inside the cave, and we're looking out into the valley below. This is quite a photograph here.
Wow. Now, that is, there in the photo, you can see that's the Saudi government's buildings, is it not?
Well, actually, those are Bedouin buildings in the far distance. But just in front of that, toward the mountain a little bit, is the fencing they put up, Saudi authorities, to keep people out.
And there's all kinds of things down there. There's even a modified corral of types.
There is, remains of an altar, remains of pillars at the base of the mountain. Here's another photo of the cave. It's not real deep, but nevertheless it is something to provide shelter from the rain and so forth. Now, Google Earth, you can look about 20 miles southwest of here, and you can see Elam. Elam was where there were 12 wells and 70 palm trees, we're told. And if you go there today, there's still 12 wells at this site.
So this is no doubt Elam.
Yes. So this is, again, confirmation we're in the right area. And
it's on the right trail. It's on
yes.
the way, is it not?
Yes, it is. Right. And so we're back at Mount Sinai again, and Ross Patterson is pointing to a spot in the distance. This is where the golden calf incident took place. We're going to see that shortly. But this will give you an idea of how Moses is coming down the mountain, and he could have seen the dancing and the apostasy taking place. And, of course, his anger became hot, righteous indignation against the apostasy of the people. And Exodus 32, and it came to pass as soon as he came nigh into the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the tables out of his hands and brake them beneath the mount. So that's what he saw. And here we can see, this is an aerial view of the large rocks where the golden calf was placed on top of this. The Saudi authorities, they have placed a fence around this once again, and there's a sign saying this is an archaeological area. Stay out.
And the clue is that there are paintings on the side that are not indicative of that area, are they?
That's right. You've been there, I guess.
I've seen photographs.
Okay. Yeah. So here we are. This is a closer shot of it. And on the sides of this, as you say, there are inscriptions of the Apis bull and so forth on the side of this from Egypt. So they came from Egypt. They're accustomed to this, Egyptian bull designs and so forth. And here Ross is next to one of them.
And that is not native to that area.
Right,
That's
right.
the key.
The Saudi locals, do not draw this type of Egyptian drawing on the rocks, in their area. So this is something brought over from Egypt, these designs and so forth. So, and then Ross is next to some other carvings here, more bulls and calves, and you see a camel and so forth. So a lot more inscriptions here showing people were here, and again, it's tied back to Egypt.
Now, how long ago was this that you could get that close to this? Because you can't do that anymore.
Right, you can't get a tourist visa. You have to get some sort of special permission from the government. You can't just send in an application for a tourist visa. You have to get a special permit, and that's extremely difficult.
And you would have to hop the fence now, too, to get this kind of photograph.
Yes, to get inside some of these areas, you can go around the fence. Some of them have. But they're, of course, they're not damaging anything. They're keeping everything pristine. So, and here's some more drawings Ross is next to. This is out in the encampment area.
Oh, so this is not at the altar itself. There are more of these.
These are a little bit away from the actual golden calf altar. These right here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then this is Dr. Kim, who was out there, went out there 12 times. He worked for the Saudi prince, and he found numerous drawings out here also. He also found these artifacts, incredible amount of pottery and so forth in the encampment area.
And he was wasn't he a personal physician to the king? He was
to one of the princes, yes. Yes. And then he found, if you can see here, the arrow's pointing to a menorah. He found a inscription of a menorah where it was actually made there at Mount Sinai, the golden candlestick. So this is where it was made, and this is the oldest image.
So there you go with some of the evidence right there on some of the amazing discoveries. Mount Sinai, and of course there's actually a lot more, I think, with Mount Sinai, but we'll see if this is the same
You
thing.
can see in the distance the blackened peak.
Yeah, we already saw that. And we want to go now to another video that is changing the topic, actually, in some measure. And this is by a very renowned archaeologist by the name of David Roll, who claims to be an agnostic and not a Christian, and yet is disgusted with all the deception of archaeologists and Egyptianologists to ignore certain facts, and of course this is all the lies that are propagated in universities throughout the world on these discoveries. And so we're going to look at David Rohl here.
At the moment. And now we try to explain that visually with Tim's wonderful wall of time from the movie, which you'll see later. He has it animated. I can't animate it here. But we have, according to Tim, he's divided up this whole era from the beginning of the sojourn with the arrival, the multiplication, the slavery, the judgment, the exodus and conquest. That's the pattern that we're looking at. And we have to try and find out where that pattern really works, those 6 steps. And if you look at it in the 19th dynasty we've been talking about, here's your pattern here. But in this period, as we've seen from the archaeologist's point of view, there is no match. There is no correspondence in that period. Or you may notice back here, there does seem to be something going on, which we're going to get to later. And then those scholars who want to have the 1450 BC date, the date that's actually in the Bible, the date from the time of the construction of the temple back 480 years, you get to this period of around 1450 BC, and we find ourselves now in the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, and again we have an exodus with nothing corresponding in the archaeological record in Egypt. And ironically, these 2 pharaohs are now, in those 2 models, the pharaohs of the Exodus. Ramesses II in 1250 and Pharaoh Thutmose III in 1450 BC. They happen to be the 2 most powerful, influential, and richest pharaohs in the entire New Kingdom history of Egypt. How likely is it, therefore, that in the most stable periods of Egyptian history, the Israelites destroyed the country, left it in complete destruction and abandonment, went off to conquer the Promised Land without the Egyptians making any effort to stop them? There is no sign at all in those 2 reigns of a crumbling of the Egyptian state. There is absolutely no sign in these 2 reigns of any sort of loss of control in Palestine, in Syria, in Canaan, for the window of opportunity for the Israelites to come in under Joshua and actually conquer the place. It just doesn't work. Neither case works. So here we come with the what if. My question was then, very simple. What if scholars had been looking in the right places for the Bible stories, but in entirely the wrong time? That was the simple and obvious question to be asked, which nobody had actually asked. Nobody had bothered to ask that question. So if we now look at Jericho, and we look at it in this light, what if we find the Jericho that was destroyed and work from there? If the Bible tells us Joshua destroyed Jericho and is abandoned for centuries, why did we look for that Jericho? Instead of saying, oh, well, it's not possible Jericho wasn't there, let's find the city of Jericho that was destroyed. Now, we know where Jericho is, Tel Es Sultan. We always know where the location is. There's no question about the identity of the place. So here we are looking at the Iron Age town that we saw earlier on, the Dark Age, and down here we have the Middle Bronze Age city, a flourishing, powerful city with high walls. So what we're going to do is we're going to start to investigate this city, because this city's walls collapsed. It was heavily burnt and abandoned for centuries, exactly like the Joshua story. And then we have this 600-year gap until the refounding of the city in the time of Ahab and Omri. If you remember the story of Hiel, who comes and founds the rebuilt city of Jericho on the bodies of his 2 sons, one under the gates and the other under the foundations. So the question is, was this city the one that Joshua destroyed? The Middle Bronze 2B city? And if that's the case, then we have to put the conquest right at the point where the city is destroyed, and therefore the Exodus 40 years earlier in this Middle Bronze Age period. So we've moved ourselves from the Late Bronze Age, where the conventional dating is, and we've moved the whole story into the Middle Bronze Age, a whole era earlier. And that's where we're going to concentrate later on today, on the conquest, and before that the Exodus, and before that the sojourn. So let's start with the sojourn. We're going to work forward in time now, from the arrival of the Israelites in Egypt through to the Exodus and beyond. And it starts with prosperity, followed by slavery. You know the story. Joseph comes into Egypt as a slave. He rises to the ranks. He helps to explain Pharaoh's dreams for him, becomes the highest official in the land. His family are brought in from Canaan during the famine period, and they are given the best part of Egypt to live in. They prosper and multiply, and then they're suddenly plunged into slavery. And then on comes Moses and the Exodus after that. But let's first of all look at the beginnings of all this. Just to recap where we are then, here is we're in now the Middle Bronze Age. Middle Bronze 1, Middle Bronze 2A, Middle Bronze 2B, that's the archaeology. In Egypt, this is the 12th dynasty, the 13th dynasty, and something called the Hyksos period, which I'll deal with in a moment. So, in this new timeline, Jericho was destroyed during the Middle Bronze 2B. We're not quite sure where in this phase, but it's somewhere in this period here. And then in the 12th dynasty, here we have the arrival of the Israelites. This is how it works with the biblical chronology in relationship to archaeology. And you'll notice something very interesting. We have one phase called Middle Bronze 2A, which is actually matching exactly with the Israelite sojourn in Egypt, and then we have the conquest 40 years later. So the Exodus takes place in the transition between Middle Bronze 2A and Middle Bronze 2B. And over here, at the end of the 13th dynasty, followed by the Hyksos period. Now, the Hyksos were invaders. They came into Egypt, and they took it over, and they dominated it for a couple of centuries. The Egyptian pharaohs were killed and slaughtered. Their families were murdered. The women were put into slavery, and the women were actually buried along with the warriors who died. They buried the Egyptian female slaves next to them. They were brutal people. This is Egypt's punishment after the Exodus. This. So here is the arrival, here is the prospering, here is the slavery, here is the Exodus, and off to the promised land and the conquest of Jericho.
What you're saying is that the pattern of evidence was seeing that which the film is going to be, explaining, and is that in this Middle Bronze Age 1 time period, the 12th dynasty, is when you saw it, and others, that there was this influx coming in to
brand new people coming into the Eastern Delta.
And they were allowed to be there. What BTEC
They were,
told me.
yeah, exactly. They were under the invite of the Pharaoh, just like in the Bible.
So when I was talking with Manfred BTEC, he said to me that these people were given an invitation to be here. In other words, it looked as if they were guests and allowed to settle in that land, matching, once again, the story, the pattern of the story.
And there's your quote. Joseph then settled his father and brothers, giving them the land holdings in Egypt in the very best part of the country, which at this particular point in Genesis it says the region of Ramesses. Other times it says Goshen. Just as Pharaoh had ordered. Pharaoh had given them permission to settle in the best part of Egypt, the richest and luscious part. And here it is. This is the land of Goshen. Photographed from the Austrian excavation dig house of Manfred BTEC, looking out on the fields where the Israelites lived.
And that was then when I started to realize that we were looking for patterns of evidence. Let's start over and say, where does the pattern begin? And that began, for me as a filmmaker, the approach to take. And I could see that was the scientific approach. Mm-hmm. And so once we said, let's be free of the dating question, let's just look for the pattern, because of all the information that you know now about the questions about dating. Mm-hmm. So that gave us the freedom to look for the pattern.
Sure. So let's actually follow this up now, just so you know where Goshen is. It's right there. So it's in the Eastern Delta. It's the nearest part of the fertile delta to Israel and Canaan. Okay? It's on the border of Egypt, effectively, and any Asiatics or Semites coming into Egypt would have settled in the nearest part to their own homeland. That's the area they were given. So what is this land of Goshen that later is called the land of Ramesses? Well, it's located in the Eastern Delta, as we've seen. It's in the nome the Egyptians call Gesem, okay, which is biblical Goshen. And it's by what we call the Pelusiac branch of the River Nile. That's the most furthest east branch of the River Nile. It's on the eastern side of the Pelusiac branch of the River Nile, at a place in this time now, in the Middle Bronze Age, which was known as Avaris. And it later became Pir-Ramesses. The city was renamed at the time of Ramesses II, Pir-Ramesses. And I suppose you want to ask that question now. Well, you know, how did that happen? How come the Bible refers to it as Ramses? Well, it's a little bit like the Dutch founding New York. Seems reasonable to you, that statement, doesn't it? Did they found New York? No. They founded New Amsterdam. But we're perfectly happy with the idea of them founding New York. Or the Roman 6th Legion comes into England and builds a garrison in the city of York, which New York's named after. You'll see that in your encyclopedias. But the Romans didn't establish their garrison in York. They founded a garrison in Eboracum, which is what the Romans called it. It was only when the Vikings came along and renamed it Jorvik that we get the name York. But you'll read an encyclopedia that says the 6th Legion founded a garrison at York. So the same thing going on here.
And the thing that we try to show in the film is that underneath the city of Ramesses is this older city of Aras. And so the challenge is that the name Ramesses actually is the name of a pharaoh, it's the name of a time period, and it's the name of a city that was built at a particular time.
The royal city of the king. He founded this city of Ramses, which you're going to see now, on top of Avaris, the older city. So what the Bible's telling you isn't so much what they built as where they built. So the Israelites built a city at the place where the audience of the time reading the Bible would know to be Ramses, because they didn't know Ramesses. Ramesses was very famous, the city. They wouldn't have known the ancient name for it, which was Avaris. So here, we're looking down on the very area we're talking about. And this thing here is what we call a tell, or a ruin mound. In fact, it occupied this entire area, but what happened was the farmers, the fellahin in this area, had been ploughing these fields and digging out the ancient site over the centuries, leaving only this last tiny bit of it left here. So this entire area was developed. And another city was found here underneath Cantia. So if I show you now the landscape as it was in ancient times, they used drill cores, about 850 drill cores, to establish that the river, Pelusiac River, the Nile, flowed through here one time. And it divided into two. So the original name of the town, or the village here, was Rowati, which means the mouth of the two ways, where the river Nile split in two, went off to the Mediterranean. And it's on these turtlebacks here, these islands, that they established the first settlement. And in the inundation season, of course, all this area would be flooded, except for these sand islands that you see here. So they built the village on top of those. So we're in the eastern side, and I'll now show you the settlements. So Avaris, the ancient city, was built predominantly on this island and in this area down here. And later Ramesses, the focus of Ramesses, the city of Ramesses, was here with a royal palace. However, the southern district of Ramesses was built on top of Avaris. So the whole thing was one massive city in the 19th dynasty. But the Israelite city is this one, the earlier one, the Middle Bronze Age one. And here it is. This is one of the photographs of the excavations a few years ago now, which have collapsed, as you see, and overgrown in this particular part on the main tell. Here's the village of Tel Edaba, which is the name that Tim mentioned earlier. Tel Edaba means the mound of the hyena, and this is the village, basically, which sits on top of the ancient Israelite city. That's what it looked like when it was being excavated in the 1960s, this particular part here, and you can see them digging down and revealing all the important archaeology under this tell. And we managed to reconstruct the actual complex here and the buildings, etc., as we found them from archaeology, from the reports. What you have is the Egyptian enclave with nicely plastered houses. You have the royal palace and the private temple of the king facing the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, and then behind it, this massive Semitic poor area where the Semites lived in this area. They also lived across the river here, but we didn't reconstruct that. But this was the main area of the town, and it turned out to be one of the biggest cities in the ancient world. It was actually more than 1 mile by 1 mile square in terms of its size. Huge population. So, the Middle Bronze II sea city of Avaris, the Middle Bronze Age city, this is the only real candidate for the era and location of the Israelite sojourn as handed down in the biblical tradition. There is no other one. This is when we have the large population of Semites. These people, as you'll see in a little while, live there for a while, they expand, they become slaves. There's some terrible disaster hits the place, they all leave. 40 years later, Jericho's destroyed. If we look at the excavations, I'll now show you what the Israelites of that time looked like. Here they are, the Austrians are excavating. You'll notice that they're digging down less than a couple of feet before they reach the levels, because the farmers have ploughed the rest away above, leaving us just the foundations. Here's a typical pair of Israelite graves. Because there are no stones in this area, because it's the delta, they use mud bricks to build their graves, and they are pits in the ground lined with bricks with a vaulted ceiling. This has been dug away, but this would have been an arch ceiling running across the entire grave here. This one has been dug out, so this one is still to be excavated. This one is open, and I'm going to show you the interior of one of these graves now. You'll notice that the body is lying on its side. Now, Egyptians are not buried on their sides, they're buried on their backs, with their hands down like that. And if you're a pharaoh, like that. And if you're a queen, like that. Okay? But an ordinary person would be buried on his back, usually in a coffin. This guy is on his side with his knees up in what we call the semi-fetal position. This is very much a trait of Semitic peoples from Canaan. This is how they buried the dead. And then along with the dead, they have pottery, which tells of the date, archaeological date of the burial. Now, some of the wealthier tombs had remarkable things in, like, for instance, this magnificent bronze, what we call duckbill axe head. So it's like a duckbill axe because it's like the beak of a duck. It's also called a fenestrated axe because it has these two holes here. But this is a very typical Middle Bronze 2A axe or weapon. And of course we have typical Canaanite pottery. This is a storage jar from the Middle Bronze 2A. So this is how we date when this burial took place, or when these burials took place. Another thing we find a lot of is tiny little vessels called tel al-Yahudiya ware, about the size, that size, which is usually for ointments, perfumes, etc. for the ladies. It's typical only of this period. Now, if I show you a waterlogged grave here, this is one from a garden tomb that you're going to see in a little while. See this object here? That is actually a duckbill axe which has not been cleaned up. And this thing, I'm just going to restore that for you. When the archaeologists removed that from the grave and cleaned it up, it turned out to be a magnificent bronze belt. Now this is what a chieftain would wear. With his long gown on, he would have this magnificent bronze belt around here, and he'd be wearing his dagger, his really important dagger, to show his status, his wealth, his power amongst the tribe. And these are the daggers that were found in these graves. Beautiful bronze ribbing, ivory handles, gold rivets to hold the framework together. This is high status material. This is not cheap rubbish. This is really top class Canaanite, Semitic weaponry. And let me just put a little quote in from the Bible. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their daggers are vicious weapons. So even in the Bible, we hear reference to these weapons, these daggers being worn by tribal chieftains, the sons of Jacob. And now, in some of these high status burials of these chieftain figures, they were brought, the bodies were brought to the grave on a truck, a cart, dragged by two donkeys, and then a pit was dug in front of the graves, and the throats of the donkeys were slit, and they were buried in front of the grave. Now that is again typically from Canaan, from Israel, later Israel. We have this type of burial. But what's important is, along with the two donkeys were two sheep placed in their sacrificial sheep. And the bone analysis by the experts on this has demonstrated that these sheep were from North Syria. They are actually the long-haired Syrian variety, which is exactly where the patriarchs came from. And this is the first time we see them in Egypt. We don't have the sheep, this type of sheep, in Egypt until this era. And we all know that the Israelites were shepherds.
I think that that's one of the things that always continued to be supportive of the story. The pattern was matching once again, the pattern, the pattern, the pattern. And I think that it wasn't just, I was surprised by some of the other, people who've looked into this. They haven't really thought much about the verses and looked at it and said, well, what are the clues you would look for?
Mm-hmm.
And once again, the pattern, when you start to add up all the pieces, the pattern really started to make sense to me. Because I didn't want to make a film that was off track.
And they are wearing, yes, you've got it, multicolored coats. This is the only time in Egyptian history we have visual art of Semitic peoples entering Egypt wearing this type of colored coat. In the New Kingdom, when you have the standard chronology, they wear white coats with trim on their sleeves and around their necks. They don't wear multicolored coats. And here is the leader of the brigade coming in, the 37 people, I would call them Midianites. His name is Abishai, and he's called a Hyksos, or a ruler of the foreign countries, and he's got a fabulous coat, much better than the rest of the men of the tribe. So status is all important here. You get the best coat if you're the leader. This is the time of two pharaohs, Senusret III and Amenemhat III, who were co-regents. This is the father, this is the son. What's noticed about these two is how miserable they are. These are the only two pharaohs in Egyptian history which look like this. Look at the way the mouth is turned down. Look at the furrows here. Look how the ears are turned, big ears are turned around at right angles. Now, in visual art, an art historian will tell you that what this reflects is concern on the part of the pharaoh for his people. It's not smiley, smiley pharaohs here. This is pharaohs who are worried, who are concerned for Egypt, showing concern for it, and it's the only time we see this. And there's a reason for it. This is the Fayum Basin, which we'll come back to in a minute, Great Lake, Birkat Karun, but this is a quote from the Bible. Genesis 41, 17-21. So Pharaoh told Joseph, in my dream there I was standing on the bank of the river Nile, when 7 fat cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile and began to feed amongst the rushes. And then 7 more cows came up behind them, starved, very wretched and lean. I have never seen such poor cows in all Egypt. The lean and wretched cows devoured the 7 fat cows, but when they had devoured them, it was impossible to tell, for they looked as wretched as ever. That's Pharaoh's dream. That's what Joseph was tasked to interpret. Now, what's important here, and what's not mentioned in the Bible, is that these cows came up out of the Nile. That's not explained in the Bible. But from this connection we've made now between the story of Joseph and Egyptian history and archaeology, we can explain the reason now for the cause of the famine. Now, you all know about Nile inundations. Every year in the late spring, the Nile floods its banks. Waters come down the River Nile from Ethiopia, from the Blue Nile and the White Nile, and they flood the Egyptian plain up to the desert plateau. And this happens regularly every year. But the level that it comes to is very crucial to whether or not Egypt prospers or whether it starves. And what we have down in Upper Egypt, this is Nubia here, there's Abu Simbel, there's Aswan. We come right the way down here to the border of Egypt in this period before we get to the land of Kush, which is in Sudan. We have 2 forts either side of a gorge. One is called Semna and the other one is called Kuma. Here's an aerial photograph of those 2 forts, there and there. And what happened was, in this particular period, in the reign of Amenemhat III, they started to record the heights of the Nile in the inundation, year by year. First time it had happened, they hadn't done it before. And we believe what it was an early warning system to tell people further north how high the flood was going to be. And if I show you a very complicated chart, I'll explain it very quickly. This is the low level of the river for most of the year. This is the standard flood level in modern times. That means the last 2,000 years here. But in this time, in the reign of Amenemhat, we see these records here, and they tell us that the flood jumped from 12 meters up to around 18 meters in year 3 of the king. And then suddenly, a few years later, it zooms up to 21 meters. So we have a massive increase in water coming into the Nile. This is 4 times the typical average flood, 4 times the quantity. So this is your 7 years of plenty, and that is your 7 years of famine. Plenty because increased water here to this perfect level means more harvest because you can expose more areas to water inundation and the fertile silt. Here, destruction, total destruction. Villages wiped out, cattle killed, drowned, sheep drowned. And the important thing is, if this land is flooded with 4 times the water, it takes 4 times as long for the water to dissipate out to the Mediterranean. So you can't plant your crops. Because when it comes for the end of the season, when you need to plant your seed in the ground is waterlogged. And if it happens year after year after year after year, you get a famine. That's why the cows came out of the river Nile in Pharaoh's dream. The Nile is the cause of both the plenty and the famine. This is the water conditions that they would have been confronted with at the time of planting. So in Genesis 45:6, for this is the 2nd year of the famine. There has been famine in the country, and there are still 5 years to come without ploughing or harvest. Now, if the famine had been caused by a drought, that would not stop ploughing. The only thing that stops ploughing is water. So what does Joseph do about it? Well, he's a genius, this man. This is the great Fayum Lake, and this is what it looks like today. It's called Birkat Karun. This is a huge lake. In the time of Joseph and Pharaoh Amenemhat, it was this size. Absolutely enormous. Why did it grow so big? Well, because of this canal that was dug from the Nile to siphon off 50% of the floodwater into this sump, to take away the potential for disaster further north. So he devised this canal, or somebody devised this canal, to divert 50% of the water. King Amenemhat was so pleased with this operation, he actually built his pyramid right on this canal at Awara. He regarded this as the most important thing that had been achieved in his reign. And the name of the canal? Bar Yosef, the waterway of Joseph. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has given you knowledge of all this, there can be no one as intelligent and as wise as you. You shall be my chancellor, which means vizier, and all my people shall respect your orders. Only the throne shall set me above you, the 2nd most important person in the land. So what do you do with the 2nd most important person in the land? Well, as he gets older, you pension him off with a beautiful house in the land of Goshen, and you can say, you can retire here with your children and your grandchildren and be blessed. You've done your duty for the kingdom, and now you can relax and take it easy. Now, unfortunately, we don't hear much about that in the Bible until Joseph's on his deathbed, where he gathers together the brethren and he tells them, I'm not going to be here for much longer, and I know that one day you will leave Egypt and you will go to the promised land. You make sure you take my body with you. You be sure, you promise me now that you will take my body with you. So let's find Joseph in the land of Goshen. We start with Jacob, because in the famine, in the 2nd year, Joseph arranges for Jacob and his family to come and settle in the land of Goshen. And in this field, Jacob built a house. This is the reconstruction from the movie of Jacob's house. It's what we call a Mittelsaal house, which is the earliest form of the so-called 4-roomed house or Israelite house. If I put a plan up, you can see that it's basically an open room or courtyard surrounded by other rooms here. These are possibly for animals to be kept in this area, but the main part of the house was this here, Mittelsaal house. It comes from North Syria, this design. It comes from the area where the patriarchs originated. This is the type of house you would expect a patriarch to build in Egypt. And of course, Jacob was a patriarch. And then, after a while, that house, according to the archaeology, was knocked down. The owner of the house had died, and it was decided to build a palace on top of it. And this is the floor of the palace that was excavated by the Austrians. What you see here is a mud brick floor which was painted white, and then you have the settings here for 2 stone bases for wooden columns to hold it up. It was basically a very, very nice audience chamber, and I'm going to show you the reconstruction from the movie again now of that Egyptian-style palace, but it wasn't built for an Egyptian, it was built for a Semite. Possibly the vizier, the northern vizier. When we look at a plan, this part over here was added later. The original facade was here, along here, and this courtyard was added later, including these 2 suites here, and a new entrance here. But the original part of the house was this here. This is the shot you just saw of the 4 column bases and the mud brick floor. This was the audience chamber to receive visitors. This was his personal washroom, and this was probably his robing room here. And this, believe it or not, was his bedroom. And this is a mud brick platform, which is the biggest bed ever found in the ancient world. You would expect that for Joseph, wouldn't you? The guy who interpreted dreams, to have the best bed in the world. Now, what struck me immediately about this, and by the way, these 2 suites are identical. How many sons did Joseph have? So when they were growing up and were getting their first wife, he built 2 apartments for them, exactly the same. No arguing. You can't have a bigger one than him. You must both have the same size apartment. And, significantly, the original facade of Joseph's palace had, you guessed it, 12 columns, representing the 12 brothers, 12 tribes. In the back garden, and this is now the palace over here, this is the model that the Austrian excavators built for the palace. You'll see a series of tombs, and I suppose you're already ahead of me. There are 12 of them. 12 main tombs, subsidiary ones, possibly for wives here, but 12 main ones. Each one had a tree planted in front of it. But you'll notice number 12 is rather different to the rest. Number 12 is a pyramid tomb. Here you see that pyramid tomb at the back of the garden, dated at the same time as the palace here. The ones that you see along the line here, and these ones are slightly earlier. By the way, those daggers that I showed you earlier on came from these tombs. Now that pyramid tomb is what we're going to concentrate on now. This is the photograph before they started to excavate down into the tomb. What you see here is a platform made of mud brick, and then on the front a base for a chapel. So you have a pyramid with a chapel in front of it. As I say, they haven't started excavating, and now the plan of it looks like this. Here's your platform base for the pyramid, here's your chapel, and underground, underneath the pyramid, we have a mud brick vault where the burial took place. I'll explain what that is in a minute. Here they are digging down into the burial chamber, and this is all they found inside. A few broken bits of limestone, and that strange thing. I'll show you the excavation of the actual tomb itself. Here we see this man in the blue galabert standing in the corner of the tomb. That's the chapel over there. There's the fragments of limestone and this large group of heavier limestone here. That is what we're going to concentrate on in a minute. And looking in the other direction, here is that object again, looking from the chapel towards the burial chamber. And in the burial chamber, all you've got is this piece of limestone and 2 more pieces of limestone from the same object. Completely empty. No bones, no mummy beads, no coffin wood, no pottery. Absolutely empty. So the archaeologists said, oh, I know why that is. Because there's a tunnel that's been dug in from the chapel into the burial chamber, and everything has been cleaned out. But then I asked BTAC, what grave robber would take the bones? What's the value of the bones to a grave robber? It doesn't work. This is not robbery. This is removal, pious removal of the body. So now the crunch time is, what is this? Well, it stood in the chapel in front of the tomb. And when they assembled the bits, it was quite clear that it was part of a human statue, the top half. But you'll notice that the whole of the face has been smashed off. This is reconstruction here. The eyes have been gouged out with an axe. Look at this massive hit on the top of the head there. But we also have a throw stick on the shoulder. I'll come back to that in a minute. If we look at the hair, beautifully coiffured, beautifully combed, and the original paint still survives on this statue, red hair, flame red hair. And on the forehead, although you can't see it too well, this is yellow paint. So yellow skin, red hair, beautifully coiffured and combed, in what we call the mushrooms hairstyle. And on his shoulder, a throw stick. Now, a throw stick is a symbol of an Asiatic or Semite. So this high official with this statue is an official of state, but he's a foreigner. He's not an Egyptian. On the back shoulder, I began to see, can you see, fragments of paint in stripes? See that one? Can you see them coming in this direction here around the shoulders, the collar, and then they go down vertically? If I highlight that for you a little bit to help you to understand it, it's a multicolored coat. So this statue, which is twice life size, seated statue of a high official of state with yellow skin, red hair, wearing a multicolored coat in a tomb, a pyramid tomb. Now, a pyramid tomb is normally not given to a high official. In this period, only kings had pyramids. Only kings had colossal statues. No individual other than a king would have that. This guy has been honored to the highest level that a king could grant. Art historians have looked at this statue and said it was carved and made in the royal workshops next to the pyramid of Amenemhat III. Okay, so the king ordered this statue for this individual. So let's restore his face. Red hair, yellow skin, collar, multicolored coat. And this is the reconstruction from the movie of the chapel with the statue. And if only we had the other part of this, we'd be able to read the name of the individual. And this is his name in hieroglyphs, and that's the name of Joseph in his Egyptian name. One of the mines where they excavated the turquoise, and what Petrie found, Flinders Petrie found in here, was quite remarkable. He found a script carved on the mine face, and it's clearly hieroglyphics, but nobody could read it.
Hold on, I want to get that.
Right on the top of the mountain, this is the temple of Hathor, who is the...
Anyhow,
turquoise, the goddess of the turquoise mines. Turquoise, the Sinai, which is up the top of this mountain. I'll do this very quickly. You climb up to the heights in the middle of Sinai, and you arrive at a temple here, right on the top of the mountain. This is the temple of Hathor, who is the lady of turquoise, the goddess of the turquoise mines. These stelae are all dedicated to her, and they have Semitic names on them of the workforce that was sent here to mine the turquoise. Here is Hathor, the goddess with the strange wig and the eyes, and she's called Hathor. And here we have Meket Mofkat, which is the Lady of Turquoise, which is her title. Here is one of the mines where they excavated the turquoise, and what Petrie found, Flinders Petrie found in here, was quite remarkable. He found a script carved on the mine face, and it's clearly hieroglyphics, but nobody could read it. It didn't read Egyptian. So Petrie was scratching his head and couldn't work it out, and then Sir Alan Gardner came along and worked out what was going on here, and he realized that it was actually Hebrew, but written in hieroglyphs, and it's called Proto-Sinaitic. So here is your Hebrew alphabet with the earliest form of writing. So what happens, for instance, I'll give you an example here. The water sign in Egyptian hieroglyphs is the word for nu, water, but in Hebrew it's mayim. So that becomes the letter M. the house, Beit, Egyptian pair. Okay, so brilliantly, he takes Egyptian hieroglyphic signs, he actually gives the Hebrew name to them, and the first letter of the Hebrew name becomes the letter of the alphabet. And it can go all the way through the alphabet, right the way down to Tav, which of course is the cross. And this one over here, Aleph, which is the ox. Let me give you an inscription from there, which you can read just about if I highlight it. This says, Mem, Aleph, Ayin, Mem. It's a very crude form of the word Mayim, and that is a leather water bag. Water. Let's look at the letter Aleph, just to show you how that evolves into the modern alphabet. Here is our modern letter A. You could do this with all the letters of our alphabet. This is it in Phoenician, rotated 90 degrees with the cross member breaking through the diagonals. And this is it in Proto-Sinaitic from this particular cave. And if I now put the details in, it's an ox, Aleph. So we get our modern alphabet through Proto-Sinaitic, through Proto-Canaanite Hebrew, through Phoenician, through Greek to our modern alphabet. That's all down to Joseph. Joseph gave us our alphabet.
And the reason why you believe it's Joseph, why do you think that that's the case?
It requires it to be a Semite with a superb education, who was an administrator, who could write in hieroglyphs, but wanted to develop a script for writing Hebrew. Now, I would have originally thought of Moses, but we now find that these inscriptions are dated to the late 12th dynasty, which is before Moses. So it has to be somebody else. And the only person I can think of capable of doing that was the man who was the most important official in the land of the pharaohs, the vizier, capable of doing all this, who was a Semite, who lived in that palace in the eastern delta. It's logical to assume that it must be Joseph who did this. So I'll get on to Moses very quickly. Who was the pharaoh who raised Moses in the palace? So here's the text, famous one from Exodus 1. Then there came to power in Egypt a new king who did not know Joseph. Joseph had died. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites are now more numerous and stronger than we are because they've prospered. We must take action to stop them from multiplying. Or if war should break out, they might join forces with our enemies. They might take up arms against us and then escape from the country. Accordingly, they put taskmasters over the Israelites to wear them down by forced labor. This is the introduction to Moses and his birth. They've prospered, they've got numerous, they've become powerful, and we've seen that because in the 13th dynasty, most of the officials were Semitic. They weren't Egyptians. In fact, even some of the pharaohs were Semitic at that time. One of the most telling and saddest things about the archaeological excavations at Tel Adaba Avaris is they found hundreds of tiny graves. These are mud bricks here, so that's a little baby. All over the site. Now, in most ancient sites, infant burials represent around 25% of the cemetery population. In other words, 1/4 of most graves you find in the ancient world belong to infants, 1 year old or less. In this site at Avaris, infant burials represent 50% of the total cemetery population. There is a massive doubling of the number of infant burials. And then, with the remaining adult population that are left over, of the remaining adult burials, there are 3 females to every 2 males. That tells me that these infants are mostly male, because there's a skew in the population. These slaves go from being 50-50 male and female to a strong bias towards female in adulthood. And we know what that story is. Now, there is a writer, a Jewish historian called Artaparnas of probably Iranian extraction. We believe he might have been from Persia. And he actually wrote a history of the Jews for the Greek pharaohs, the Ptolemies. And his history was placed in the Alexandrian Library. Then, of course, later on the Christians came along and burnt it to the ground, and we lost his original manuscript. We've never been able to recover that. However, Other people, other scholars, quoted from him extracts from his History of the Jews. And he tells us the Pharaoh who raised Moses in the palace. Even though the Bible just says Pharaoh, he names him. Now remember, he's writing in Greek for his Greek masters, the Greek pharaohs, the Ptolemies. This is what he calls the Pharaoh who raised Moses. Chenofres. Three elements. Chenofres. We can translate that back into Egyptian as Cha-Nefere, or Cha-Nofre. That is the name of just two kings of ancient Egypt. One in the Old Kingdom, which doesn't count, and this guy, Cha-Nefere Sobekot IV, is one of only two kings in the entire history of Egypt with this prenomen. In other words, the coronation name. So this is the name Artapanos gives to the Pharaoh, and we can identify him with this king called Sobekot IV. Here he is. He's the most powerful pharaoh of the dynasty, the 13th dynasty. Here are statues of him from Karnak. He is the 29th ruler of the 13th dynasty. I'm very quickly going to show you his position. But he probably had a summer palace like this one at Avaris, where he would have met, or Moses would have been raised, and then perhaps in the confrontations of the Exodus, this had been the place where those confrontations would have taken place. If you look at the site again from a different angle, you can imagine, here's Pharaoh's palace and the temple. You can imagine the princess bathing in the water here, or coming out to bathe in the water here. And down here, the baby Moses being placed in his basket, and then the water taking him towards the palace where he would have been found by Pharaoh's daughter. When you get the archaeological evidence, you can start to see the story evolving and working. So Moses was then raised in the palace of Chenofres. He would have been an educated man, learning hieroglyphs, etc. Here we see a fragment of the royal canon of Turim, which is a king's list of the pharaohs. And here we get this last sub-dynasty that enslaved the Israelites. Sobekot III, we have a Brooklyn papyrus with slave lists with Semitic names in there. And then we have Neferhotep, a very powerful king, and Sobekot IV, who was the one who was the father, stepfather rather, of Moses. When he died, that's the start of the 13th dynasty. When he died at the bottom of the papyrus, the 29th king, we come to the next column over here. We need to be looking for the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So if I go 45 years down, it's approximately 45 because we don't have the exact dates, we come to this little fragment of the papyrus here, and the name Dudimose. Remember that name, because he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus, not Ramesses II. This nobody, this guy who nobody's ever heard of. He's virtually the last king of the 13th dynasty, and it's his time when this happens, according to Manetho. Have you heard of Manetho? He's the Egyptian priest who wrote a history of the Egyptians, who mentions, quoted in Josephus, who mentions this, and this is quite striking. In the time of a king called Ptolemais, remember he's writing in Greek again for the Ptolemies. Ptolemais is Dudimose. In his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us, and God here is in the singular. You would expect an Egyptian to be writing, and the gods smote us, but he doesn't. He refers to one God smiting the Egyptians, and he continues, and Kai in Greek, which means what follows on from God smiting. Unexpectedly, from the regions of the east across the Sinai, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force, they easily seized it without striking a blow, and having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. That is the punishment of Egypt. That is post-Exodus, the invasion of the Hyksos, coming into Egypt, being able to take over the land without striking a blow. There is no army to defend Egypt. Why? It's at the bottom of the sea. Otherwise, Egypt would have been defended by the army. And at this very moment, at the city of Avaris, Toledaba, in stratum G1, the Austrians came across scores of pits in the ground, shallow pits, with bodies thrown in on top of each other. Look how this guy's leg, lies across this guy's chest. This one is flat on his back. That one's on his stomach. Here's another example. This guy has just literally been tossed into the grave and his arms fallen forward. Betak, the excavator, says what happened in Egypt at this moment was a terrible plague struck the place. And the people died. And they had to bury them in emergency burials for fear of contamination of the survivors. And right afterwards, the entire Asiatic quarter of the city vanished. They simply closed their doors and they left. And for a period, we're not too sure how long, maybe 5 years, 6 years, the place was left the drifting sand. And then in came the Hyksos and occupied the site and completely bulldozed it flat and built a mortuary cult on top of this site, where they buried the Hyksos kings. At the end of Stratum G, marking the end of the 13th dynasty, the main Tel area was abruptly abandoned and the Semitic population vanished. So here we are, this is the location now we're dealing with. We're not saying Ramesses in the 19th dynasty was the pharaoh of the Exodus. We're saying it happened down there under Dudimos at the close of the 13th dynasty. And this, 40 years later, approximately 40 years later, is when we should be looking for a Jericho that was destroyed. And then we have the Egyptian collapse with the Hyksos dominating the country for 2 centuries before the recovery in the 18th dynasty. So, we're not going to deal with where they went, because that's for the next film. So I'm going to very quickly jump forward to the conquest. And I should be able to wrap this up within the time we've got left. So remember our chart. We have the Iron Age town built by Hiel on the body of his 2 sons in the time of Ahab, circa 800 BC.
That's enough for this.
Then